Okay, welcome. Two more welcomes. Welcome and welcome. One for the East Coast, one for the West Coast. One more welcome for the Midwest. We're trying to include everybody. Thank you for joining part of our continuing series where we talk to reporters, writers, professors, anybody on the left, anybody on the right. And we want to provide their opinion to you as long as they're thoughtful in an unedited and unaltered format so that you could do this thing that was popular back when I was in high school called thinking for yourself. Maybe we'll have a renaissance. Maybe we will not. We'll see. With us today, it's our privilege to have Professor Luke Fowler, PhD. He's the Associate Professor of Public Policy and Administration at the School of Public Service Faculty at Boise State University. Associate Professor, Faculty Director, School of Public Service, Boise State. He's an Associate Professor of Public Policy Administration and serves as the Faculty Director for SPS. His research interests include policy implementation, collaboration, and collective action, energy and environmental policy, and state and local government. Dr. Fowler is the author of more than 36 journal articles appearing in many of the field's top journals, including Governance, Public Administration, Policy Studies Journal, Review of Policy Research, Administration and Society, American Review of Public Administration, State and Local Government Review, and State Politics and Policy Quarterly. His latest book is Environmental Federalism, Old Legacies and New Challenges. She's also the co-host of The Big Tent, a weekly public affairs radio show on Radio Boise. Previously served as the MPA program lead and completed his PhD at Mississippi State University. He's an assistant professor, tenure track. Before that, he was at Valdosta State University. Then he was at Mississippi State University. Some of his educational background, in May 2013, he had a dissertation for state and federal environmental policy, a hierarchical linear model of CAA and CWA implementation. Also received a Department of Political Science and Public Administration. He had a degree from them out of Mississippi State University. And then also his research interests we've already covered. Master of Arts in Political Science was at Mississippi State University, and the thesis was The Future of Energy in Mississippi, Policy and Politics. I actually watched a documentary on that last week. Peer or edited review journals, articles he's worked on. Creatively interpreting policy to move science forward. Implementation, participatory technology assessments at NASA. Impressive. Strategies for dealing with policy ambiguities. That's what we're going to be doing today. Is Florida really that interesting? I'm sorry, that caught me off guard. I watched this show. This guy has this flip phone and he just records weird stuff in Florida. And I immediately went there. Sorry. State geographic bias in public administration research, searching for green elephants and other mythical creatures during the Trump years. That should be interesting. Partisan and congressional voting and environmental legislation and superhuman or subhuman positive dehumanization and gender in public performance evaluations and using multiple streams framework to connect policy. Let me have 1 second here for the computer to go to the next page. And this is the research. We've interviewed a few people. He's part of this, and we want to get into that. But before we do, let's check in and see how well we did. Professor, did I mispronounce anything? Is there something we need to review?
No, I think you covered it fairly well. I will say that I do have a new book that came out this summer called Policy Implementation in an Ambiguous World. So, if anybody's interested in that, buy it. But otherwise, you did a pretty good job covering my bio based on what you can find online about me.
Let's see if we can find that book. Is that already out now?
Yeah, it's from SUNY Press. Happy to send you a link if you would like.
Let me see if Google will do the hard work for us. Democratic Policy Implementation in an Ambiguous World by SUNY Press. 1 second. Let me pull it up.
Sir.
And that's the book, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so you can go and get that book now. That's just out. Democratic Policy Implementation in an Ambiguous World. I love that. A square peg into a round hole. God, is that a great innuendo. Real quick, not to digest, what is this book about? I'm curious.
It's about trying to implement policies, and really, like the metaphor I use is fitting a square peg into a round hole. Because often when we come to policy implementation, the way things get written in Washington or our state capitals isn't really how things work on the street level. And so when you get there, it's like, you're a cop, you're a teacher, you're a social worker. How do you take what are these broad ideas based on a series of assumptions and fit them into what is the real problems that you're facing? And, frankly, making decisions very, very quickly based on the fact that you have a citizen in front of you that you're trying to provide service for. And so it really just tries to kind of parse that out theoretically and explain why the things that happen at the street level don't always line up with what policy happens, how much power we actually devolve into the hands of street level bureaucrats through all of this, and why it makes our government really, really complex. Because as I always argue, policies don't solve problems, implementation does.
Nice.
And so it's not, the things that we want to solve does not require us to write new policies. It requires us to implement policies well. And so this book tries to explore some of those issues.
That's an important issue. I don't want to digress too far, but that's an important issue. I know that the Supreme Court's going to start looking at that. The level of policy implementation and directions that unelected administrators of that policy can pursue, that could really change the law. A lot of people are not aware of the fact that somewhere in the 70s, 80s, I don't know, 90s, maybe 2000s, it just got really complex to implement law. And so what Congress members found was they would say the big, fluffy, big part up front and pass a law for that. And then they would push off all the details and the difficulty to the administrator. And the reason they would do that is the administrator could just decide policy and implement it. It wasn't in Congress. There was no televised hearings. They didn't have to present it to their constituencies. These are unelected people. And so for the last 2 to 3 decades, what we've had is the majority of policies implemented by people who you never know about, you never study, you never saw on TV, never elected it, and are unelected themselves. And that's just the way we've been doing it. It's not really anybody's fault. It's kind of something we fell into. But it also means that, you think you're passing some law, you don't know exactly what you're getting because they won't take the time to delve into the details because we can't have those conversations in America anymore. So I'll leave it there. Unless you wildly disagree with my interpretation, Professor.
No, I think that hits the nail on the head, right? I would just add to that,
Please.
that as much as this creates challenges for democracy, there are some practical realities to why that happened, right? Because it's extremely difficult in a nation that is as big and complex, as diverse as ours, to give everybody what they want all the time. And so sometimes that delegation actually helps us match citizen needs with governmental services better, but it also creates all these really complex questions for democracy about who is really making the choices here.
Brilliant. Maybe would you ever come back on to just discuss that?
Yeah, absolutely. I love talking about this stuff.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And for everybody, I'm a history buff. Maybe I'm wrong, but I believe square peg into round hole comes from the astronauts, and they were stuck in the shuttle, and it was orbiting the Earth, and they had to figure out how to get 2 parts in the space shuttle to connect, and one was a round hole and one was square. And you had the greatest minds in all of America working on this, and what they came up with was duct tape. So I'll just leave it there. Duct tape solves everything. It saves astronauts. It's a wonderful product. Okay. And I expect my money from the duct tape manufacturers for that. So let's get that clear. What is this book about? Why is it important? But before you answer, why is this important? Why did professors from 10 to 20 different universities across America come together to look into this the last couple of years? It sounds like people are coalescing around some idea. Why is this worth looking into? Why did so many professors join this, and why did this happen in the last couple of years?
So first, I want to say, Nick Loveridge, the first name there, he gets all the credit for managing this project and put it together. I mean, he really, really did a lot of work, as well as a lot of co-authors. So I don't want to speak and make it sound like I'm the person who ran this, because
of course,
Dr. Loveridge gets all the.
Others have said that too. Thank you, Dr. Loveridge.
So what this comes out of is the fact that one of the things that we've, witnessed, seen, observed, however you want to describe it, in society in general, is that we don't necessarily treat each other with respect and kindness as much today as what we have in previous years, or at least observationally, that's what it seems, right? I mean, one of the things about, I guess, social sciences is always is like, do I remember things differently, or are things actually differently? And so one of those things that we definitely start witnesses more of, or at least there's more observations of, is incivility in state legislatures, fighting, terrible names being called, threats, violence, all of these things that, these are elected officials. You would imagine there needs to be a degree of decorum, of professionalism, and instead, we have, great examples. I won't go through some of the names, but there's a couple of really funny examples that we try to
name names if you want.
I mean, Chris Christie called a state legislature numbnuts. We managed to get that into one of the papers, which I was really proud of, that we got that published somewhere. Just as, funny stuff for us to do and work in. But, there's lots of stuff like that just seems very, very out of place in the halls of democracy, where you're supposed to have a lot of people come together and decide what's best for our community. And then they're just calling each other's names and then screaming at each other. And so this lack of what I would call, civility, right? I mean, even you can look at Congress between when it came to the Kevin McCarthy issues, right? I mean, whatever we think in terms of democracy, but there was also a lot of people there that were not treating each other with respect, as adults, as equals, as representatives of the people. And so this was the core of this book is a survey of a lot of lobbyists across state legislatures, right? And so the beauty of looking at state legislatures and studying them is that we have one Congress, and so there's like not a lot of points of comparison in that Congress. But with state legislatures, we have 50 different state legislatures that are all in different socio-economic, political environments. They all have different personalities involved. And so we can isolate a lot of the factors that play into this and ask questions like, hey, why is it that some places are there's incivility in some places and other places are civil towards each other? Like, what are some of the things that help us understand what's going on here, and explain some of this? And, I guess the spoiler alert is it's not simple, right? It's not one thing. It's about 20 different things.
To back you up, I was looking for the name. I can't find it. There was a very, very long-term, well-respected, well-thought-of African-American lady who's been in Congress for decades, and she is really well-respected and well-thought-of. And they released a tape the last 2 weeks. One of her staff members just recorded it, and she is just cursing at them and calling them every nasty name she possibly could. And this is just a course of business for her staff. And when that came out, people were shocked. They're like, well, hold on, you're this distinguished Congress member. We've seen you speak about morals and proper behavior. Secretly, you're talking like a sailor who's mad to your staff for the last 2 decades. When did this start getting bad, Professor? I famously heard about, LBJ did interviews with his staff while he was in the toilet. I mean, at some point, we've had bad behavior before, or has it gotten significantly worse in recent history, in your professional opinion?
So that's a good question, right? I mean, I think one of the intervening factors here that we really have to think about is whether or not that technology in particularly has put these behaviors on display, right? I mean, because we can think a lot of things that came out of the Kennedy and Johnson White Houses, some bad behaviors that would have been all over social media, right? Would have been covered from a million different angles that were largely covered up. I mean, you can think Kennedy's affairs, you can think of Johnson exposing himself to reporters, which is a documented historical fact, did not get talked about at the time, is pictures exist today, right? So those things are a question, right? If this is this congressman you're referring to 30 years ago, if somebody didn't have a cell phone to record her, could she have gotten away with us and never have known, right? So one of the factors that exist here is that these behaviors can't be hidden anymore, right? Not in Congress, not in state legislatures, not in normal office places, because you never quite know if somebody's going to record you. So one thing I would argue is that I can't tell you when behaviors have gotten worse, but what I can say, excuse me, is in about the last 2 decades, we've become much, much more aware of these behaviors. And we know, I mean, they're never a good look. They were not a good look in the 50s. They're not a good look now, that nobody really respects these things. Nobody really thinks they're okay. and you can ignore them when they're happening behind closed doors. But when you have video footage of it happening, it's sort of hard to go, well, maybe it didn't happen. It's sort of hard to come up with the mental gymnastics that allow you to say that behavior is okay. So I think that's really the thing that shifted, is that so much more of this behavior is on display through social media, through the internet, through 24-hour news cycles, like all of this stuff. We now see it so much better than what we did ever before.
Through this, right? The phone.
Yeah, exactly.
The phone is changing. I saw something just to back you up. Not going to digress, and I'm not going to talk about it. I'm just going to say. So they're doing Pentagon hearings on if there's UFOs. Again, I'm not getting into it. And I was like, that's bizarre. Why are they talking about it now? And then I saw an ex-Pentagon analyst say, so many of the soldiers have this now. We can't hide it anymore. We used to be able to tell our soldiers, give me your camera, take that down, never speak about this. And that worked. And then now I took film and posted it in 12 seconds. Whoops, was I not supposed to do that, General? And I've heard some, I don't know if it's true or not. I'm just saying there's a theory from a top-ranking person. They can't control secrets in the military anymore. Everybody's got a phone. Everybody's got social media. They're trying to police it as best as they can. And it's tough. Is that some of what you're getting at? It's just too damn easy to record and report these days in a way we never had access to in the previous decades.
No, absolutely right. That is exactly what I'm getting at. Our lives are essentially transparent in a large part, right? You never know. I can say personally on this campus here at Boise State, we've had some incidences where the president of the university made comments in front of faculty. She was recorded, and those things were immediately put online and used to embarrass her, which is not really fair to her in a lot of ways. But at the same point, we are placed in where, us as individuals, particularly as government officials or public employees, cannot say things behind closed doors, right? We have to trust that everything, or believe to a certain extent, that it's so much easier for the things that we say to be put out there in front of everybody. Sometimes that's not fair because it's taken out of context. Sometimes it is part of democracy to expose the dirty secrets of our government, but it certainly has changed the dynamic here, right? And so I'll go back and I'll say, one of the challenging parts, or at least interesting parts about being a social scientist in 2023, is you have to ask the question, has the world changed, or the way that we observe it just changed? And so I go back to, I don't know that it's never not been this bad, but I do know that we're seeing a lot more of it. And so, that's really, really a fascinating, important question. I also say is observing these bad behaviors is definitely changing our democracy. It's changing the way that we interact in a lot of ways.
Yeah. I remember, again, I'm not going to digress, but I remember that there was I remember growing up in the 90s and 2000s, and they were saying, are more men abusing their wives? Because we constantly see that in the news. It must be growing. And they're like, well, hold on, is it growing, or are we just talking about it now? And now we're actually dealing with it as a society, and we're seeing it, and it was always there. I'm more to believe it was always there, and we're finally just moving on to having the discussions we need to as a society.
The same thing with sexual assaults in the military, right? There was, as soon as we started talking about it and taking it seriously, that those numbers shot up, and people were like, "This is happening more." It's like, no, people are actually coming forward and reporting it, that it's actually being treated seriously, as opposed to where it was kept a secret. And so those are, that's an important part of this, is that we can't just go by what we know to observe a social thing, right? That sometimes stuff happens that we can't observe.
So I bring up all these bizarre examples, and they have nothing to do with politics, but I bring them up because they have to do with the fact that we are in a new technological revolution, and that we're not able to control information like we used to be able to. And that might be leading to new awareness. The New York Times said that the internet today and social media is the equivalent of the Gutenberg printing press in 1550. The Gutenberg printing press destroyed the 1,000-year run Catholic empire and allowed new states like Germany to form, because they couldn't control information anymore. We might be in the same period, people breaking away. So we can't answer if things got worse recently or if we're just seeing it. Let's move on. What did you guys see when you were studying how lobbyists view civil discourse in U.S. state legislatures? I think you've done 2 or 3 versions of the book, all of them looking in the last couple of years. Did you find people are civil to each other and everything's fine in America, or did you find something totally different from that?
So for my part of the book, working with the doctors Stephanie Witt and Jackie Kettler, and I want to give them a lot of credit because I did not do this work by myself. We looked at structural factors that help explain why levels of civility shift between states. And so to your first part of the question, yeah, in some places within state legislatures, people are treated civilly. Like everything's fine. There's nothing really to talk about. Maybe there's an issue here or there, but for the most part, they meet the standards that you would expect. And in other places, absolutely not. People treat each other like garbage, right? So there's a variation. We have 50 states. Some places are good, some places are bad. We looked at some structural factors that tried to help us understand what was going on there. Things like ideology, partisanship, economic inequality or economic growth and change, as well as some structural factors like citizen legislatures, size of government, and all that kind of stuff. The first set of this stuff is pretty straightforward, which is that states, or we'll call communities, states, whatever, where there is a lot of heterogeneity, right? A lot of like different opinions, people are more likely to treat each other without civility, right? It's really, really easy to be polite with somebody that agrees with everything you say, right? Mm-hmm. That is. And so if we're in a state that is a trifecta Republican, everybody voted for Trump, we're all in agreement about all the core things, nobody's incivil to the others, right? We're all on the same page. In places where there is a lot of change going on, right? Whether that's political change or even economic change, structurally our economies are changing in places like, say, the Rust Belt, Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky, those kind of places where you see the economy change, that creates a lot of challenges for people to identify where they currently sit into the world, right? Where they fit into the world, what their identity is, what their political identity is, what their economic identity is. That creates a lot of frustration. And when you're already frustrated and somebody says, hey, you're wrong about who you voted for, oh man, that's where you just blow your top, right? Right. And also, and frankly, and being from the South, I take this, from a lived experience. Historically, when it comes to structural racism, which is to say that it's a lot easier to look at people that are different from you and say they're the problem, right? Rather than taking that ownership onto yourself, right? Which is to say, like, oh, I'm economically displaced. It's clearly the Democrats that did it to me because I always voted Republican. I have no ownership over this. It's them that are attacking my way of life, right? And so to separate ourselves in that way allows us to be incivil to each other, right? And opens the door. Now, again, to juxtapose that with the other way, I mean, when our economies are stable, our political identities are stable, everything's going good, we love our lives, why wouldn't you be civil to somebody else? Why would you be civil to somebody that's going, oh, yeah, you're great, Marcus, and you're doing everything right, and I agree with you, right? Why would you be a jerk to me in that situation? So that's the first kind of grouping of variables or how I would explain to them, right, is that incivility is rising in places where there are structural challenges to the way things are and people don't know how they fit in. Now, I can keep talking. I don't know if you want me to stop there and you can ask me.
I want you to keep going. You're crushing it.
All right. So the other kind of group of variables that I would talk about, particularly when it comes to state legislatures, are the let's call them the political networks for ease of this conversation. I'm sorry, I've got a little bit of a cold, so I keep coughing.
All good.
So in large states where there's a lot of different people that you can work with, because let's get it, with government, you can't do anything by yourself, right? You have to have other people agree with you. And a government of the democratic government, right? Clearly, if you are the dictator, you can do stuff by yourself. But in a democratic government, you have to have other people agree with you. In large states with really dense policy networks, right? There's lots of other people I can work with, which means that if I'm a jerk to you, Marcus, and you're like, I'm never going to work with Luke again.
There's lots of other people you can work with.
Exactly.
Okay.
Smaller states with smaller policy networks, people's reputations get around. It's easier to isolate them. And if I'm a jerk to you and say a place like Idaho, which is small, which is isolated in a lot of ways, my reputation gets around as all these people start deciding, like, I don't really want to work with him. It's only a matter of time before I'm not able to get anything done. So I have to rely on my own personal political capital to get these things done. Right? And again, I'll juxtapose this with somewhere like, say, California, New York, right? Large political machines in those states, lots of state legislatures, lots of lobbyists. I can be rude to whoever I want to because there's always going to be the next man up that wants something from me.
Oh, yes, I've seen that here. Yes. Yeah. You're right. You're right.
So,
yeah.
And that would be my simple kind of a structural explanation, right? Is there's these two groups of faculties, right? Or really it comes down to what are the incentives for you to be in civil and what are the consequences for you being in civil to others? And some places are set up to allow that to happen, and some places are set up that it doesn't happen.
That's brilliant. One second here. That's brilliant. So I think what you're saying is, why does political incivility happen? Well, for two reasons. One is there's structural changes happening. Things are changing. People don't know exactly how to fit in. They're scared. The other one is that in small states, your reputation gets around. That kind of limits the amount of trash talking you can do. But in large states, you can be a horrible person for years before it finally ever catches up to you. Is that roughly fair?
Yeah, I would say that's roughly fair. At least in looking across states, right?
That's brilliant. That's brilliant. And that's the findings from this paper. So let me ask you this, if I may. The Atlantic magazine came out with an article called The Geography of Partisan Prejudice, a guide to the most and least politically minded counties in America. And this is the map they came up with of overall political prejudice. This took me a minute to figure out. So dark green means very prejudiced. White or light gray means minimally prejudiced. Blue somewhere in the middle. Let me make sure I got that right. Yes. So does this match what you were seeing? I mean, we're seeing a picture of different states with different levels of political prejudice and meanness towards the other side. Does this match up with your research, or does it kind of seem to show something very different?
Yes. I mean, I'd have to dig in a little bit more specific to it, but for the most part, it does show that, right? This idea that we judge other people are mentally, we have a tendency at a cognitive level to sort people into groups, right?
Okay.
It makes it easier, right? Have you ever heard somebody go, there's two types of people in the world, or there's three types of people in the world?
Yep.
Like that happens at a cognitive level. It is ingrained in the way it is because by categorizing people, we can make sense. There's this process called sense making that a lot of people write about and talk about. So when we get in places where all right, there's me versus them, it's a lot easier to understand what is going on whenever you start categorizing people like that. But that also leads into the sense that because they're different from me, they're less human than I am. They're less deserving of the same respect that I am. It's a lot easier to dehumanize people when you put them in a separate group. And so these are the mechanisms that we play on. Now, the other thing that I see from this map is political prejudice, particularly where it's correlated with partisanship and at the county level. One of the things I don't think gets talked about enough is there are much more vicious ideological fights going on in the Republican Party right now than what there are in the Democratic Party. And our findings largely align with that, showing that incivility is more likely to happen in Republican-controlled states. But it's because there's a lot more ideological diversity going on there than what is really reported or talked about. And so one of the studies that you talked about that searching for green elephants, one of the things that I found was in that article was in Congress, Democrats are really, really homogeneous when it comes to voting on environmental legislation, meaning that they almost always vote the same way. Like across the party, there are very few outliers. Everybody's in agreement about environmental legislation. On the Republican side, that's not true. There's actually a lot more diversity going on in the Republican Party, ranging from people that there are still climate change deniers to people that would think we need to take aggressive federal action to address climate change, right? So there's a huge gambit that's going on there. And so what I also see in this map is that those challenges are playing out in the way that in Idaho, the big phrase is rhinos, right? Republicans and name only.
Right.
That there is like a litmus test for whether or not you get to be part of our group. And in order to be part of that group, you have to accept all of the things that we say. And if not, we're going to judge you for it. And we're going to treat you differently because of it. And so those type of things end up being really important for, again, how we respect others in our interpersonal interactions.
Is this the study searching for green elephants and other mythical creatures? Are there any environmentalists left in the Republican Party using exploratory factor analysis, EFA, and data from the League of Conservation Voters for the 115th and 116th Congress? The authors find that around 25% of the Republicans in the House of Representatives and 40 of those in the Senate are more supportive of environmental legislation than the average Democrat in their respective chambers when separating partisanship from environmentalism. However, the findings also suggest that environmentalism for Republicans tend to focus far more on conserving existing programs and resources than it does on advocating for progressive new policies. Tell me again, how does this relate to incivility?
So let's take it back to McCarthy's speakership.
Okay.
The viciousness and how pissed off Republicans were at Matt Gaetz. That's what this data shows, right? That when you are holding on to your majority tightly and trying to get something done, and members of your own party are throwing grenades at you and running away, God, that pisses you off. As opposed to the other side, like all through that, Democrats were all very respectful of each other because they were all on the same page. They all knew what they had to do.
Right.
And so, again, it is easy to be civil with people that are in agreement with you. It is very difficult to be civil with people
that
okay. Don't agree with you, but also don't agree with you in a way that makes your life frustrating.
Okay. And this map roughly seems to reflect that.
Yeah, again, when you're looking at partisan competition, particularly intra-party competition within states.
Yeah, I mean, this is saying Florida and Texas are very polarized. I think so is South Carolina. I think that's South Carolina.
Florida and Texas in particular stands out to me as places where, you know, people like you're either on our team or you're not. And if you're not on our team, God help you.
Okay. So that seems to make sense. Florida and Texas politics. You're on our team or God help you. That makes sense.
That'll be the quote that people take away from this, right?
I don't have to put it up if you my family's from Texas. They moved out here 50 years ago, so I back up what you're saying, so you're not the only one saying it. I very much remember that. There were certain things we weren't allowed to talk about because we're from California, and we have very different opinions on politics. Just a quick digression. I've seen a lot of Democrats say all Latin people think alike. No, they don't. My Texas Mexican family does not have the same opinions on a wide variety of opinions as us Latinos in California, who've been separated for 5 decades from each other. We love each other. We call each other routinely, but we don't talk about energy, war, who to vote for, transgenderism, LGBTQ. That's going to go nowhere. You know, it's like, oh, how's Abuela doing? So anyways, not to digress, but so this does make sense to you, Texas, Florida. So what you're saying is these places where we see a dark green, they might have the attitude of you're on my team or you're just, you know, a super evil person. Not just I disagree with you, just you're bad.
Yeah. I mean, let's just think about the broader narrative that goes on, right? Republicans think all Democrats are, you know, are cowards or not, or don't think, you know, complexly, don't understand the world and what it means, right? They're all just rich in their ivy towers, and Democrats all think Republicans are idiots, right? And don't really see the bigger, and that kind of a separation, which is if you don't agree with me, it's you're an idiot, and therefore I don't have to listen to what you say, and I also don't have to respect the fact that you say it. And that plays up into structural things, particularly when we see state legislatures where we're seeing this type of conflict, that legislatures are not respectful of others that by their own identification, aren't going to support what they want to do. And so they're like, you're not on my team, Marcus. I don't have to show you respect as a professional. Get out of here.
Okay.
Yeah. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, you were talking figured. Hey, if you're not laughing, you're crying when I study this. So sorry. That's why I tell a little bit of jokes to keep my sanity. Not to pick on just the South. Okay. Yes, Texas and Florida, but this also shows New Hampshire, Vermont, Connecticut, and Massachusetts also super. If you're not on my super liberal team, you must be working for Satan.
Well, and we also have to combine that with looking at cultural and political economic challenges in those places, right? I mean, the world's changing quickly. Rural areas in America are quickly getting displaced, right? I mean, there's always been this long-term fascination with ruralism, the romanticism of rural areas. I teach a class on rural government. I love to start by talking about Hallmark movies and around the holidays. Everywhere, every one of them is the same plot, right?
Yeah.
Big city girl goes to small town.
Yes.
That is it. We have this fascination, but what all those things, what those movies miss out on is it's very, very difficult to live in rural places. And so there's this mismatch, and it's challenging to live in rural places when all those things that romanticize it are being taken away and they were being replaced by a lack of jobs, high rates of suicide, high rates of drug addiction, what economists at MIT call deaths of despair, particularly in rural places amongst white men, right?
Yeah.
And so, again, in these areas, there is this challenge for, this is our way of life. And if you're not on board with that, then you're trying to take things away from us, right? And if you're trying to take things away from it, like, I'm not going to be friendly with you. And again, that trickles up. One of the things that one of our I guess, theories around this is that legislatures, particularly representing these areas, they go out, they talk to their constituents, and they feel that frustration, that being mad, and then they take it back with them, right? I mean, you go, I don't know if you've ever been a mediator between two people, right, that are not talking to each other, and you go talk to one and you listen to how pissed off they are, and then you go back and talk to the other one, and even when you're trying to be neutral, you're a little pissed off because you could feel it from one person. That's one of our theories that goes on here, is that legislatures are going back and they're listening to their constituents, and they're taking those emotions with them back into legislatures.
Well, I'm trying to get this to show. 1 second here. Just wanted to back you up on something. 1 second. Come on, computer. But just to back you up totally, yes. Every Hallmark movie, I don't really typically watch them. There's a actress named Vanessa Hudgens. I'll just say that. I'm a fan of hers. That's all I'm going to say. And she's kind of an exotic girl from the urban areas, if you know her bio. But every story, she plays this princess who gets transported back to, I don't know, the middle of Connecticut or something. And it looks like the houses from Happy Days. And I'm like, that's a little weird. But they made 3 of these movies, and this is the same thing. City girl goes back home to country hometown, and etc. Just to back you up, here's a statistic. Previous studies have shown that rural areas in the U.S. have a higher age-adjusted death rates than metropolitan areas. That's from the American Journal of Preventive Medicine, so it's definitely there. So you're saying that people get frustrated in these hyper-political environments, and then they absorb that. Which is kind of their job. If we think about it, you're supposed to be a representative of your community, not just a message giver. You're supposed to represent your community. Routinely, we expect our politicians to care about the issues that we care about. So I could see where if you're a politician and you're from Florida and everybody hates the other side, you're sort of technically doing your job by taking that emotion back to Congress or wherever with you and saying, my people feel this way. So it's not good, but I don't want to say that it's not democracy working to some degree. But obviously, we've gotten to a point where this is unworkable in general.
So you just made a really, really good point, right? It's democracy to some degree. Democracy is not easy. It was never meant to be easy. Right. Dealing with people is not easy, right? And so these are one of the things that we have to think about when it comes to a functional democracy, is how far are we willing to go in representing in order to actually represent those things. But what is the trade-off between functionality and practicality here, right? And as we talked about earlier, when we were talking about the Supreme Court and how we delegated all these powers for implementation to administrative bodies, it's the same question, right? How far are we willing to go to make our government practical versus democratic? And often those things are loggerheads with each other.
That's said. Wow, that's really well said. How far are we willing to go to make our government democratic versus functional?
Yeah, we can go functional, practical, bureaucratic, whatever you want to call. I mean, the lesson I continue to teach my students is bureaucratic governments are efficient and effective. Democratic governments are representative. Moving towards bureaucracy takes away opportunities to be a democracy. Moving towards democracies take away opportunities to be bureaucracies. Trying to find systems that are both representative and efficient and effective is extremely, extremely challenging. And so there has to be a balance between those two things, because otherwise, we just sit around and argue with each other about crazy things and nothing happens. But the flip side of that is we have a dictator that doesn't listen to anything. Everything moves very, what's the famous thing about Mussolini? The trains running on time.
Yeah.
The trains run on time, but we're also in a fascist state. And so there's got to be balance somewhere in the middle there. And maybe at this point in time, we've maybe teetered too far to one direction and we need to come back.
There's a lot to that. Absolutely agree. When you look at international policy and you look at administration, there's a lot of American experts who will say straight up, Chinese government officials, not the bureaucrats in the Politburo, but the guy who runs the sanitation department, the guy who runs the sewers, way better than American officials. They're very dedicated to their job and they're perfect. Problem is, they live in a dictatorship where you can be disappeared if you don't do, if the government just doesn't like you. We have a version of that here. It's related to terrorism, but it's not as bad. So do we want the hyper efficient Chinese system where you live in a dictatorship and you can be disappeared? I mean, we don't hear about it in the West, but they'll have union riots and all those people are just gone somewhere, right? So we don't like the working conditions. Okay, 300 people disappear. Who knows where they went? I don't want to live there. At the same time, I'd like to have good officials who can do their job. It sounds like that's somewhat of the balance is like, boy, we could have this super perfectly functioning government. Singapore is another example. Singapore has one of the most perfectly efficient governments ever. It's also the most repressive technical democracy in America. They technically have a democracy, but they basically elect a dictator every 4 years. They go, you're the new dictator for the 4 years, and you can act like a dictator, but we'll have an election in 4 years. And that's a system that would never work here. I mean, they elect Mussolinis every 4 years and think it's a functional democracy. So there is this drawing point between the two. Obviously, I don't think Americans would want to live in that system, but obviously our administration, we don't have clean drinking water in Flint, right? So I think you're getting at what's the happy balance point.
Exactly. And, frankly, it's the thing that we're always talking about, even when we're not talking about it. I think one of the things that's been lost, particularly in the last couple of decades, is that nobody recognizes that it's the thing that we're always talking about, even when we're not talking about it. You know what I mean? Like in every policy conversation and the Republican debates, watch them. They are talking about this. They're just not saying they're talking about this. And frankly, I don't think some of them realize they're talking about this.
Probably.
And so that's the thing, right? Is that America needs to realize that this is the conversation that we're always having. We're always having this conversation. And really, maybe it's a good time for us to have it explicitly rather than implicitly. And that's just conjecture, but, it comes from somebody that studies this. So.
Tell me the difference between now, and this is why we interview you guys, because you're the experts in the field. The difference now, we're a democracy. I don't think we run super great like we used to, but still technically a democracy. And we have trouble providing services, providing correct administration to people. I mean, they couldn't even fix Palestine, Ohio, the Department of Secretary of Transportation and the president could even be bothered to visit it. I mean, or Hawaii. That's horrible. You can go back to the 1950s. Government was very effective. We were getting all sorts of bills passed, building all sorts of infrastructure, rising living standards. At the same time, though, there was kind of a unified vision of what America was. I mean, there wasn't that much difference between the Democrats. I've looked into this. There wasn't that much difference between Democrats and Republicans until maybe the 60s. You go back to the 40s and 50s, and they were slightly different. Is that why we could have a functional government in the 50s and the 60s? Is that why we could have infrastructure taken care of and people taken care of? Because that's the great heyday of America. And as the further we get away from there, it seems like things work less, cities break down more. So, is there something to that?
I mean, I think there's a couple of factors to identify between, what's going on now and what's going on then. One would be, I mean, as you pointed out, less partisan polarization. And even within that, we can make that more narrow to say that there was more of a shared vision for what America is and how we define ourselves as Americans.
100%.
One of the things I think underlines a lot of this cultural conflicts that we see is there's different versions of what it means to be an American, and who is a real American, because real Americans deserve rights and liberties and, government services, and non-real Americans don't deserve those things. And so there's a much broader debate about what it means to be a real American today than what there was in the 40s or 50s. And I think there was a lot more agreement then. The other thing I'll say is it's a lot easier to balance this when you have a growing economy. When you have more money than what you know how to do with, that's a lot easier. And so there was a growing change in the economy now. Our economy is slumped, or at least it's stabilized. Again, we can look at comparisons between the baby boomer generation and now the millennials, which I'm part of, what it means for economic prosperity. Since I've gotten out of college, I've lived through two economic recessions, two of the biggest economic recessions and so these things have had massive impacts on my perspectives of government in a lot of ways, because I'm just like, what are you doing, guys? So I mean, I think that's also a challenge is the economic growth and change part. And the other part, I'll go back to the technology and their ability to communicate, which is that people's expectations are changing around government because they realize what they don't have. And so in the 40s, if you never left your hometown, I mean, like, what is normal and what is good? Like, I love the line from Hamlet, right? There's nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so. If you've never left your small town in Texas, it seems normal and it seems good and it seems okay. And if you're in the 40s, you probably have no idea what Hollywood looks like or what Malibu looks like. But, today Americans not only have the internet, but we also travel more. And so we know, like, if you've probably know what's going on outside of your small town in Texas. And so you have higher expectations. And so it's not just like, hey, why does my town suck? It's like, why does my town suck while everybody else has a better town?
Right. They're doing better than me. That's also
one of those things. Well, I'm sorry, please say that again.
They're doing better than me.
They're doing better than me.
Keeping up with the Joneses.
We know it. And that's something that I don't think people knew in the 40s, was that people were doing better than them.
I could totally back that up. So my mom's a CFO of a Fortune 500 company now. But when she was a young Latina in Texas, they were dirt poor. I mean, wood floors and partly dirt on the floor. And total stereotype, 3 different Mexican families in one little shack. My father grew up in a mining town. But they both told me the same story. They lived in these shacks on dirt floors with very harsh conditions. Yeah, they were fed. Nobody starved, but it wasn't good. They had no idea they were poor until they got to be 30. They had no concept. Everybody was living that way. It must be the way the whole country is. And so I noticed with them, because I've also lived in the poorer part of Fresno now, they don't have resentment. Whereas people who knew they were growing up in the ghetto, because I got bussed into the ghetto basically in high school, and so I met a lot of people there. They were very resentful. They were very aware. We're here. The rest of society's there. When I talked to my parents, they don't seem angry that they were poor because they had no idea. Everybody was the same. But we thought we were being treated fairly. So just to back you up, they had no idea there was something better.
Yeah, I mean, again, like it's the sense of unfairness that I think people, because again, this is supposed to be a democracy. We're all supposed to be citizens and equals, and somehow some of us are treated unfairly. In the 40s, I think either people didn't know they were being treated unfairly, or frankly, if you were non-white, there was a very clear explanation about why
Right,
you were
right.
being treated unfairly. And so at least people knew why. And in 2023, people are being treated unfairly, and they're going, wait, aren't we all supposed to be equals? And that whole explanation that I'm non-white doesn't stand up anymore because we're saying that's not true or shouldn't be true. And so like all these things go, well, why am I being treated unfairly? It seems like you're just singling me out. Right. And so again, this leads to a lot of resentment, a lot of frustration, just a lot of challenges. Right. And then that trickles up to legislatures who then go to Congress and yell at each other.
We just don't have enough to go around to make it good for everybody. There was a debate in China, in Hong Kong, I believe. Jack Ma is the equivalent of Steve Jobs in China. He's their Steve Jobs. So they like him, but he kind of upset the Chinese government because they were at a technology conference and there was a bunch of Americans and a bunch of Chinese and other people. And they got into this debate on politics. And the Americans were like, democracy makes you great. And the Chinese were like, no, total control makes you great. And they're having this debate in the audience. And then Jack Ma tells both of them, you're both wrong. It's not about government system. It's about paying money to take care of your people. Frankly, China's building roads, schools, dams, everything. So we used to do that in America in the 1950s. Then we stopped about 72, 75. And he goes, if you spend money on your people, things are good. And if you don't, it's not. And he contradicted both his own communist government and the Americans. It kind of sounds like a little bit of what you're saying. If the tide's rising, all boats rise with it. It's a lot harder to be angry with each other when economy is good. Things are growing this year. Things are going to grow so well, I can expect my children to have more than me. Okay, maybe that guy over there has more than I do now, but I'm getting more every year, and my kids are going to get even more than me. So I don't need to be that angry. Is that somewhat of what you're talking about?
Yeah. I mean, I think that starts to hit on it. One way that I always try to and so I'm a department chair. That's what faculty director is. And I've got about 50 employees that answer to me. And I talk to the dean sometimes. And so people act out or maybe, act unprofessionally. Sometimes. And one of the things that I always say is, I think people are just generally frustrated and they're looking for opportunities to be specifically frustrated and people to target that at. And so there was one case where somebody was doing something and I was like, she's making a big deal out of this. I don't actually think it's about this. I think this just gives her an opportunity to justify being pissed off about something. And so all the things that are going on, and to bring this back to state legislatures and polarization and all that stuff, people are generally frustrated about what's going on in the world. They need something specific to be frustrated about. So why not Joe Biden? Why not be frustrated at Joe? You know what I mean? Like, why not be frustrated at Donald Trump? Why not be frustrated about energy or abortion or anything else? They're pissed off about everything, but I need something specific to target that at. I need a specific person to yell at. I need a specific place to talk about this. So why not bring it in these areas? And so they show up, and even when we're yelling about coal mining in West Virginia, it's not just about the coal mining, it's about the state of the world. But the coal mining is the thing that we can get mad about and it'd be reasonable and justifiable and not make us look irrational.
Seen that. In psychology, they call it transference. I'm angry
Yes.
about this. They will transfer it to something else. In Fresno, we called that cruising for a bruising. You're just mad about something and you're picking at somebody, and people, the good people will go, you're having a problem, I'm going to stay away. But eventually somebody's going to go, oh, you have a bad day? I'll meet you halfway, homie. So we call that cruising for a bruising. And we'd say that to each other if you were acting up, like, you need to calm down. Okay, I'm being nice to you. I let it go. Someone else isn't. But it would be these people who, I'm so mad, I'm just looking to start a fight. And I'll wait until I find the right person because I need to. I could see that. There's also a higher level of stress, it seems, with Americans these days. Maybe that might be, I've seen some studies saying that's linked to higher coffee consumption, maybe, but could also be, the government doesn't work like we used to think it does. January 6th was scary to people. 22 cities on fire for BLM was scary to people. Having an election doubted by an entire Republican Party was scary to people. Having Hillary Clinton lie and misuse the FISA process and the FBI and not be prosecuted by justice at all was scary to people. It's a lot of scary things. How do I handle these giant existential things when I'm not even allowed to go to Washington, D.C.? Well, I can't, but I'm still mad. I could attack this. Is that maybe what's going on with us as Americans?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. Listen, I'll tell you, I love talking about this stuff, but I'm also just a normal dude. I've got 2 kids and a wife at home, and I just want to go to work and do my job and go home and hang out with my kids. And things like January 6th are terrifying because they're like, okay, like, what does this mean for me?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Should I go to work today or should I not? Should I stay home and like lock my doors with my, you know what I mean? Like all of that stuff, right? On both sides that are disruptive and make us question whether or not we can continue to live our lives the way they are. Because here's the thing, I'll go back to, if
That's
everybody
brilliant.
can just go out their day on their normal routine and nobody messes with them, we will all be polite to each other. Right? And so all of these disruptions, all of these things that create this stress and anxiety, all of these difficult moments that we put people in are just increasing the stakes of it all. And that's translating up to our institutions.
That's brilliant. All these things make us wonder if we can continue on as we are. And they're scary. Where do we direct the stress? Okay, we're winding down. Thank you so much for talking about the research. Thank you so much for being able to go off the research and talk in an extrapolated manner. I really appreciate it. It helps the audience to understand that's why we do this. Your last 2 questions are this. Number 1, $1 million question. How do we fix it? How do we make it better? Here's a magic wand. This looks like a pin, but I'm going to virtually give it to you. You have a magic wand. And you can, yeah. Oh, perfect. Nice.
All right, I'm a magic wand.
That worked. That actually worked. Okay. And you can wave this wand and you can get 300 million people to think the way that you want, behave the way that you want, have a Congress passing the laws that you want. Can laws passed fix this? Is this a generational issue? What do we need to do to fix this? If you had the power of Thanos from the Marvel movies and you could just snap your fingers, what would you do to make America get fixed in less than 5 years?
Oh God, I don't have a good answer to that.
The power of Thanos, the power of the universe.
So I would say 2 things. One, at the individual level, if Americans knew, one, what the bottom of the barrel in America looked like and what the bottom of the barrel in the rest of the world looked like. Maybe we'll just say this way. If Americans had more perspective on the world and how well they treat it, and I'll say I fall in this trap sometimes and I think about the things that I want to do with my career and how I'd like to have a vacation home and all of this other stuff. And then I step back and go, you know, I have a pretty awesome life. Like I have 2 wonderful kids. I have a good job. I have a nice home that I own. We have 2 cars. You know what I mean? Like all of this stuff. Like when I sit back and have that perspective, I'm like, I really shouldn't complain and I should just be happy. Like even when bad things happen to me, like I still have a pretty great life for all intents and purposes. And so one, I would say I would give all 300 million Americans perspective. Institutionally, the thing I would say is a nonpartisan president. And that's going to sound weird, but for 2 reasons. One is the 18 months, 2-year long presidential campaigns are not good for America. They get us too deep into politics and too polarized. We've created this entire industrial complex around it. So we would stop that. And 2, a nonpartisan president to play mediator and be an objective voice everywhere else, right? Which is to say that Congress, the Republicans and Democrats are fighting in Congress. Joe Biden is a Democrat, so he's clearly on one side and not the other. But if we had a neutral third party there that could come in and go, here's what we're going to do, guys. Here's how we can do it, compromise, without either side feeling like they lost or gave up too much. So Americans need perspective, and then we need a neutral party in Washington to help deal with these things. So a nonpartisan president. Those would be the 2 things that come to my mind.
I really like your answer. I haven't heard that from anybody else, and I think it makes sense. You're splitting up in the 2. It's everybody needs to have a epiphany. I like that. Everybody needs to look inside their heart and do some soul searching across all of America. And you included yourself in it too. And you go, hey, we're all susceptible. We all need to do this. I think that would definitely calm things down, to take a minute and go, let me look inside myself and see how I am, and if I have an imperfect perspective on the world, and if I'm not appreciating things correctly. And then finally, a nonpartisan president, maybe someone like RFK, the Kennedy guy who's running. I'm not endorsing him at all. I'm simply saying he seems to be hard to pin down as exclusively left or exclusively right. He'll say a couple things to the right. He'll say a couple things to the left. Would that be something like what you're saying?
I'm not a fan of RFKs in particular.
Yeah, maybe that was a bad example.
To go back, like John McCain would be great in that role. As like him saying like declare himself no longer a Republican and just sit in office and go, I'm gonna help y'all work through this. Like somebody like him, right? The classic statesman of American government that we seem to not really have that much anymore, as opposed to the partisan.
McCain did challenge his party routinely, and he had no problem doing that at all. And he also was going to run with Joe Lieberman, a Democratic Jewish man, and which was going to ruffle some feathers in his party. And he was quite willing to do that because he believed, I'm not endorsing McCain, but the man believed in America. He was 100% a patriot who 100% believed in this country, although he also recognized that we didn't do everything perfectly. I remember he criticized us on torture. I thought that took a lot of courage. Again, not endorsing him, not endorsing RFK, just trying to have a conversation. Okay. Last question. You're not you. You're not me. You're a third-party person watching this interview. And they watch this, and it's a week from now, and they watch this, and they go, wow, I learned a lot. Boy, that professor took all the extrapolated questions, and he really gave a pretty good, interesting, creative answer. But they're struggling to remember everything. But they're saying to themselves, it's 5 days after I watched that video and I'm struggling to remember it all. But there was this one thing that the professor said, and I can't get that out of my head. What is that one thing, Professor?
Oh, God, that's another good question. So I would say this, like incivility, it's coming from the struggles of what it means to live in America today. That's it, right? That's sort of like the core point. It trickles up to institutions. It's being driven by economic, political, social changes. But the end of it is frustrating for a lot of people to live in America today, that we're in an inflection point in American history in the same way the 60s were. And this is where we're at.
Wow. Is polarization today as bad as the 1960s? Worse? Not as bad?
Depends who you ask. There's political science measures that try to look at it and say it's not. I don't know. I didn't live through the 60s, so it's really hard for me to have that. It feels like it's pretty bad. So I don't know.
I don't know if that's the answer, but just okay. And I appreciate everything. We'll end it there. Thank you for coming out, Professor. Oh, last question. You don't have to answer it now, but if you know anybody else who'd be willing to be part of an honest conversation, if maybe you could mention them in an email if I send you a link to the video. You don't have to. We've reached out to everybody in the study, in the state study. So it'd be other professors that you know who may be willing to have a truthful conversation on political polarization wherever it goes. You don't have to name anybody, but we always try to keep the conversation going. So I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, I can definitely think of a few people to recommend. If you'll shoot me an email, I'll connect you with them.
Perfect. I'm going to shoot you an email pretty soon with a copy of the video, and we'll go from there. Thank you for your time. Thank you for coming out. Thank you for studying this, and thank you for being willing to take some unorthodox questions and understanding that we're just trying to get the public to understand. I really appreciate that.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. Really enjoyed it.
Okay. I'll send you a copy soon, and we'll leave it there.
All right,
thank you, everybody.